took him out of the car seat and I laid him on the chair, and I had his diapers right here, and then someone said hola, and I couldn't even turn, and that was just, I don't remember nothing. I got up off the floor and I didn't see my child.
Before a baby disappeared, a mother spoke, and then she stopped. Rebecca cried out her observations about Jake. Small things, strange things, the kind of details you only notice when you live with someone. But when the questions got sharper and the stakes grew colder, her voice faded. Half answers. Pauses. I can't talk about that. And somewhere in that silence, a 7-month-old vanished. We are told to judge what we hear, but in this case, what we don't hear might be the loudest clue of all. Rebecca's early words felt like warning flares. A temper here, a secret there, an unease she couldn't shake. Then tight lips, canceled interviews, statements trimmed down to safe sentences. Did she lose the courage to speak? Or did something, or someone, take that choice away? There are reasons a mother stops talking in a case like this, and none of them are simple. Fear of retaliation, of losing another child, of escalating violence behind closed doors. Control, coercion, intimidation, or psychological grip that turns truth into a liability. Legal pressure, a lawyer's advice, a protective order, or investigators instructing her to keep quiet. Trauma, shock can lock the mouth. The brain protects itself by going wordless. Complicity, or survival, a person can be both involved in a cover story and terrified of the person writing it. So what is Rebecca's silence? A smokescreen, or a survival tactic? A lie told to shield guilt, or a lie told to stay alive? Meanwhile, the other half of this story stands very still. Jake's quiet does not look like the silence of prayer. It looks like the silence of strategy. And when a father's past is violent, and a mother's present is mute, we are left with a question no community wants to ask out loud. Is Rebecca silent because she's hiding the truth, or because the truth is hiding her? Tonight, we follow the warnings she tried to give, however faint. We study the gaps, the pauses, the things she would not say. We weigh the possibilities: intimidation, legal pressure, trauma, complicity, or all of the above. And we confront the hardest thought of all. If Rebecca could not speak freely before the disappearance, what kept her from speaking after? This isn't about gossip. This is about a child who cannot speak for himself, and 2 adults whose words and silences may decide whether he is ever found. If you think this is uncomfortable, good. Discomfort is the beginning of truth. This is DetectiveMax. We're not here for clicks. We're here to ask the question everyone avoids: what stopped Rebecca from talking? And what does that say about Jake? And about what really happened to Emmanuel? If hearing this makes you uncomfortable, good. It should, because babies don't just disappear, lies do. But before we dive into this, kindly subscribe to our channel if you believe in fighting for justice. We've just crossed 4,000 subscribers, all because of your support, and we need that same energy to reach 5,000, then 6,000, and then 10,000. So go ahead and drop your fingerprints on that subscribe button and where you're watching from, because wherever you are, the day this vision is fulfilled, I will send my appreciation straight to you. Let's keep building this community that fights for justice together. The story begins not with silence, but with a cry. Rebecca's cry. In her own words, she admitted fear. She admitted unease. She admitted that something about Jake, the man who should have been her partner in safety, her anchor in the storm, was instead the source of a growing shadow in her life. Her statements weren't elaborate. They didn't have to be. Fear never needs decoration. Her voice cracked. Her eyes carried weight. Her words were almost warnings whispered into a void. And then days later, Emmanuel Haro was gone. So we have to ask, and we cannot ignore it. Why would a mother cry out warnings about the father right before their child disappears? That question should chill us to the bone, because cries like Rebecca's don't come from nowhere. They don't appear by accident. They are born out of lived moments. Moments we, the public may never fully see. This case isn't just about a missing baby. It's about the fractures of a home that seemed destined to break. A mother who could not speak fully. A father whose history casts a heavy shadow. And in the middle of it all, an innocent life that had no defense, no shield, no choice. Tonight we look not just at Emmanuel's disappearance, but at the cracks that led here. We return to Rebecca's cry, because sometimes the first words spoken in fear are the truest words of all. A baby missing, a mother unheard, a father with a past. That is where we begin. When Rebecca spoke about Jake, it wasn't in polished statements. It wasn't in well-crafted accusations. It was in fragments, words you almost have to lean in to hear. Words that at first could be brushed aside as the natural struggles of a strained relationship. But in hindsight, those fragments feel heavier. They feel prophetic. They sound like someone whispering that the ground was breaking beneath her feet, and no one came to check. She described Jake's temper, not the kind you see in shouting matches in public, but the kind that flickers behind closed doors. Sharp, sudden, the kind that makes you watch your words before you speak, because you never know what will set it off. Rebecca lived in that tension, tiptoeing, second-guessing, watching his face for the storm she feared was coming. She described Jake's secrecy. The quiet phone calls, the doors closed just a little too quickly, the way conversations ended the moment she walked into the room. She may not have known who he was talking to, or what was being planned, but she knew enough to feel the chill. Secrets don't belong in a home built on trust, yet the walls between them grew thicker. And Rebecca was on the outside looking in. And she described Jake's dismissiveness. It wasn't just his anger that hurt. It was the silence that followed. The way her questions were brushed aside. The way her unease was treated like foolishness. That's the kind of dismissal that cuts deeper than a raised voice, because it tells you your feelings don't matter here. Alone, these details might look like the struggles of a troubled couple. But together, and placed against the backdrop of Emmanuel's disappearance, they sound different. They sound like a drumbeat building in the background, leading to something inevitable. Rebecca's words, subtle, trembling, scattered, have now become haunting in hindsight. It's as if she was speaking into a void, hoping someone would hear, someone would step in. And maybe deep down, she already feared that time was running out. So we ask ourselves the chilling question, was this simply a mother's intuition, or was it a direct warning about Jake that nobody listened to? Because history has taught us something. When mothers cry out, when they whisper about shadows in their own home, too often they are dismissed, until the tragedy has already struck. Rebecca may not have been able to say much. Maybe she was afraid. Maybe she was controlled. Maybe she was silenced. But what she did say was enough to send shivers through anyone listening now. And that's why her cry matters, because sometimes the first words spoken in fear are the truest words of all. The day Emmanuel vanished was not just another day in the Haro household. It was the day when Rebecca's quiet warnings began to make sense, and the day when the cracks in Jake's story first began to show. From the very beginning, the timeline doesn't rest easy. Rebecca described what happened to police in her trembling voice. She spoke about ordinary moments turning into chaos. The child who should have been safe inside his home suddenly gone. She clung to details, trying to piece them together like broken glass. Where was Jake at that exact moment? What had he said? What had he done? Her account painted a picture of panic. A mother searching, calling Emmanuel's name, trying to retrace steps in a house that suddenly felt like a hollow shell. But Jake's story shifted. Where he claimed to be, what he claimed to have seen, the way he reacted, none of it flowed as smoothly as it should have. When a baby disappears, you expect desperation, frenzy, instinctual chaos. What investigators noticed in Jake was something else, a calm that felt unnatural, a tone that didn't match the weight of the moment. Police reports suggest that Rebecca was the first to cry out for help. She called, she pleaded, she begged for answers. Jake, meanwhile, seemed detached, giving statements, controlling the narrative, positioning himself as someone trying to help, rather than someone crushed by the loss of a child. And yet, even in those first few hours, contradictions began to surface. Rebecca told investigators she had seen Emmanuel last in one setting. Jake's version shifted that location. Rebecca said she noticed odd behaviors in the hours before. Jake downplayed them, as if they didn't matter. And most chillingly, Rebecca's voice carried the tremor of fear, while Jake's carried the weight of control. The house itself told its own story. The absence of signs of forced entry, the lack of evidence suggesting a stranger came in, which leaves only two chilling possibilities. Either Emmanuel left under someone's watch, or he was taken by someone inside. Step by step, the timeline begins to unravel. The ordinary morning routines blur into a fog of unanswered questions. At what time exactly was Emmanuel last seen? Who was responsible for watching him? And why do the stories diverge the moment police ask for clarity? This isn't just a missing child case. It's a timeline fractured by contradiction. A mother's panicked cry on one side, and a father's shifting words on the other. And it forces us to ask, when Emmanuel disappeared, were we already looking at the hand that may have been responsible? Because sometimes the truth doesn't vanish with the child. It sits quietly in the inconsistencies of those left behind. Every disappearance has two stories, the one told in public, and the one whispered in the shadows. And with Jake, those shadows are impossible to ignore. As investigators began to pull back the surface layers, a troubling portrait of Jakes Haro started to emerge. He wasn't just a father caught in a nightmare. He was a man with a history, a past littered with moments of violence, bursts of anger, and a pattern of behavior that made Rebecca's quiet warnings feel more like prophecies than fears. Neighbors whispered about his temper. Those close to the family recalled times when Jake's control felt less like protection and more like domination. Rebecca herself had confided her unease, her observations of his secrecy and volatility. To her, the warning signs were not subtle, they were glaring. Yet to outsiders, Jake often presented himself as calm, measured, even collected. But silence can sometimes scream louder than words. While Rebecca's voice shook with grief and desperation, Jake's presence was marked by an unnerving quiet. He didn't lash out, he didn't break down. He didn't openly plead for Emmanuel the way most parents would. Instead, his silence hung in the air, heavy, suffocating, a silence that investigators couldn't quite explain away. This is where the contrast becomes almost unbearable. On one side you have Rebecca, her cries echoing like a warning no one wanted to hear. On the other, Jake standing in that silence, as if choosing every word carefully, guarding every gesture, keeping whatever truth he carried buried deep inside. The question is simple, but haunting: was this the silence of shock, or the silence of guilt? Because history tells us something chilling. When a person's past is painted with anger, secrecy, and control, their silence in the face of tragedy often isn't protection, it's a shield. And as the days stretched on, with no sign of Emmanuel, that shield became more noticeable. The community began to ask the question no one wanted to voice. Was Jake's silence hiding the truth about what really happened to his son? When a child vanishes, it doesn't just fracture a family, it rattles an entire community. And in Emmanuel Haro's case, the ripples spread faster than anyone could contain. At first there was fear. Parents clutched their children a little tighter. Neighbors locked their doors earlier at night. Everyone whispered the same question: how could a baby disappear without a trace? But soon that fear turned into anger. Rebecca's tearful words, her quiet warning about Jake before the disappearance, began circulating. And once they did, suspicion grew like wildfire. Social media lit up with theories, accusations, and endless speculation. Some people pointed directly at Jake, dissecting his every move, every expression, every silence. Others defended him, insisting that grief looks different for everyone. That silence doesn't always equal guilt. But one thread cut through the noise like a blade. If Rebecca saw the signs, if she cried out her suspicions before this tragedy, Then why didn't anyone listen? That question became the echo that haunted the community. Neighbors whispered it behind closed doors, strangers debated it online, and the media amplified it, feeding the divide. On one side were those who stood with Rebecca, believing her cries were the ignored warnings of a mother who saw danger before anyone else. On the other side were those who hesitated, unsure, pointing out that suspicion isn't proof, and fear isn't evidence. The public split wide open, sympathy versus blame, trust versus suspicion, and in that split, the pressure on Jake grew heavier by the day. Because in cases like this, perception is power. And once the court of public opinion starts turning against you, it doesn't just change the conversation, it can change the course of the entire investigation. The silence inside Jake's home was no longer just a family's grief. It was a storm, building, spreading, and threatening to consume everything around it. When a child goes missing, investigators often say the first 24 hours are the most telling. They're not just racing against time to find the child. They're racing against the story that the adults in the room begin to spin. And in the case of little Emmanuel Haro, those first hours didn't just raise questions. They cracked open a timeline that still doesn't make sense today. Rebecca's account was emotional, frantic, raw. She told officers she had seen Emmanuel earlier that morning, in their home, safe and sound. She described an ordinary day, suddenly shattered by the gut-wrenching realization that her child was gone. Her panic was evident, her words unsteady, but her desperation was genuine. The kind of chaos that comes when a mother realizes her baby isn't where he should be. Jake's account, however, was different. On paper, his version should have lined up with hers, two parents describing the same day. But instead of clarity, Jake's version added confusion. He claimed to have left for certain errands, yet his phone records showed suspicious gaps in location tracking. He insisted he was in predictable places, but neighbors recalled noises, car movements, and odd activity that didn't quite line up with his story. The timeline, when reconstructed, painted two very different mornings under the same roof. Morning 7, 9 a.m. Emmanuel is reportedly seen at home. Rebecca confirms this. Jake claims he was preparing to leave, but already the details blur. Midday, 10:12 p.m. This is where the timeline begins to fall apart. Jake's whereabouts are murky. His digital footprint, texts, calls, GPS, suddenly drops into silence. Rebecca remembers panic setting in during this window. Afternoon, 1:03 p.m. The disappearance is reported. Rebecca's call is shaky, filled with urgency. Jake's demeanor, according to first responders, is colder, detached, not what they'd expect from a frantic father. Evening 4:07 p.m. Neighbors and volunteers begin searching. Whispers spread that something feels off. Some recall Rebecca's earlier concerns about Jake. And the question starts to take shape. Was this child really taken, or did the truth start unraveling inside the home? The longer detectives studied the discrepancies, the more it became clear someone wasn't telling the full truth. Tiny inconsistencies, a time slightly off here, a memory that doesn't quite match there, began to stack like bricks. At first they seemed like stress-induced mistakes, but layer them together, and they no longer looked like coincidence. They looked like misdirection. And what becomes chilling in hindsight is this. When timelines fracture in a disappearance, it almost always means one of two things. Either a witness is confused, or someone close to the child is deliberately hiding what really happened. In Emmanuel's case, the silence around Jake's movements during those missing hours became deafening. Rebecca's words, emotional and imperfect, at least carried the sound of fear. But Jake's silence carried something heavier, the shadow of suspicion. The timeline wasn't just unraveling. It was tightening, like a rope, pulling investigators, and the public, closer and closer to the possibility that Jakes Haro wasn't just part of the story, he might be at the very center of it. When investigators replay those first critical interviews, one thing becomes painfully clear. Rebecca and Jake weren't just telling different stories. They were living in different realities. Rebecca's voice was cracked with panic. She described Emmanuel's smile, his clothes, the exact last moment she believed she saw him. Her body shook as she spoke, her hands clutching at tissues, her words spilling out in bursts that felt less like rehearsed lines, and more like a mother's frantic plea. Even when her details faltered, her emotions did not. She radiated fear, guilt, and an almost prophetic grief, as if she already sensed the worst outcome. Jake, on the other hand, sat straighter, quieter, almost detached. His answers were clipped, factual, sometimes mechanical. When asked to describe Emmanuel's last moments with him, he hesitated. His pauses lingered longer than expected, as though he was searching for a safe version of the truth. He never once broke down in the way Rebecca did. Some would argue that grief looks different on everyone, but to others, especially investigators, who've seen this pattern before, it looked like something else. Control. Neighbors who saw Rebecca at the time described her as hysterical and barely holding on. Those who encountered Jake, however, used words like cold, short, and unsettling. His refusal to join search parties, his absence from community efforts, and his visible distance from Rebecca only fueled whispers. It was like watching two halves of a broken mirror. Rebecca's side was all raw anguish and vulnerability. Jake's side reflected silence, calculation, and guardedness. And between those halves lay a missing child. The divide became so glaring that even online forums and local chatter split into camps. One side defended Jake, claiming that not all men show emotion in tragedy, that his composure could have been shock. The other side, however, couldn't ignore the weight of Rebecca's earlier warnings, her quiet but haunting suspicion of the very man now sitting across from her. And so the question grew sharper, more haunting. Was this simply two different ways of processing trauma, or was one parent living in the truth, while the other was carefully constructing a lie? The emotional contrast between Rebecca and Jake didn't just shape public opinion. It hardened the sense that Emmanuel's disappearance wasn't random. It wasn't just misfortune. It may have been born out of a house divided. A house where one voice cried out for help, and another voice refused to speak at all. In almost every modern disappearance, investigators lean heavily on one silent witness: the cameras. They don't lie, they don't forget. And in Emmanuel's case, they became the cracks in Jake's story. When Rebecca first told police about the disappearance, she mentioned that Jake insisted there were no cameras nearby. To her, it felt like a throwaway remark. But to detectives, it was strange. Why would someone emphasize that? Almost as if dismissing surveillance before anyone had even asked about it. Detectives did their job. They canvassed the neighborhood, pulled footage from traffic cams, nearby convenience stores, even private security systems from neighbors. And what they found didn't align neatly with Jake's claims. One clip, grainy but telling, showed a vehicle matching Jake's near the time Emmanuel was last seen. It wasn't damning in itself, but it placed him in an area he hadn't mentioned in his statement. Another angle from a street corner camera hinted at movement that contradicted his timeline. He said he was home. The footage suggested otherwise. The community didn't miss this detail either. Online discussions began to light up. Why would Jake dismiss cameras if he had nothing to hide? Why would his route not match what he told investigators? The contradictions weren't just technical. They were human. Every shift in his story looked like a carefully rehearsed adjustment to account for evidence. Meanwhile, Rebecca's cries seemed to take on a chilling new weight. Her warnings about Jake's secrecy, her unease about his behavior, now stood shoulder to shoulder with actual footage that hinted he was somewhere he didn't want people to know about. Detectives, of course, wouldn't openly accuse him yet. They needed more, but behind closed doors, the surveillance footage was enough to raise eyebrows, enough to rewatch his interviews, pause on his hesitations, and wonder if every "I don't recall" was really hiding a memory he wished to bury. And this raised an even darker possibility. What if Jake wasn't just silent because of shock? What if he was silent because the cameras caught a version of his truth one he couldn't risk saying out loud. The surveillance puzzle didn't solve the case, but it reshaped it. It shifted suspicion. It brought Rebecca's warnings into focus, and it began carving out the shadow of a man who might have been closer to the disappearance than he ever intended anyone to know. When a child disappears, entire communities transform overnight. Streets fill with volunteers. Strangers become searchers. And Emmanuel's case was no different. K-9 units swept the area, noses pressed to the ground, weaving through brush, dirt, and backyards. Helicopters circled overhead, combing the landscape with heat sensors and spotlights. Volunteers from nearby towns poured in, forming human chains that stretched across fields and wooded areas. Rebecca, frail and trembling, stood among them, every breath tight with fear, every glance at the tree line, holding the desperate hope of a miracle. But nothing. Day after day, the search produced nothing. No footprints, no discarded clothing, no trace of Emmanuel. Every lead, no matter how promising, seemed to wither before it even began. Dogs picked up scents, then lost them. Tips came in, then collapsed into rumors. It was as if the child had vanished into thin air. And this was when the whispers began. Whispers that turned into questions. Why were the searches failing so completely? Why did every trail run cold so quickly? One unsettling possibility began to form. Maybe someone knew exactly what they were doing. Jake, he knew the area. He knew the routines. He had the time, the access, and perhaps the anger. Rebecca had already cried out her concerns. Her warnings painted the picture of a man with secrets boiling under the surface. And now, with every failed search, suspicion tightened around him like a noose. Could Jake have orchestrated this disappearance with chilling precision? Could he have removed Emmanuel in a way that outpaced dogs, helicopters, and even hundreds of searching eyes? The thought is horrifying, but it's also unavoidable. Because when every official effort ends in dead end, the only explanation left is the one nobody wants to face. That someone close to Emmanuel ensured there would be no trail to find. When the search for Emmanuel yielded nothing, the silence was deafening. But into that silence came a roar. The media. Local news anchors set up outside the Haro residence. Cameras pointed at Rebecca's tear-stained face. Headlines splashed across TV screens and social media feeds. Mother warned of trouble before baby vanished. Reporters latched onto her every word, her trembling voice echoing across living rooms nationwide. But while Rebecca cried into microphones, pleading for Emmanuel's safe return, Jake remained absent, silent, distant. His refusal to face the public painted its own kind of picture, one that the media eagerly filled with suspicion. Social media amplified the storm, and hashtags surged. Comment sections overflowed with anger, pity, and blame. Strangers became self-styled detectives, dissecting every clip, every gesture, every word. Some rallied around Rebecca, calling her a mother ignored until it was too late. Others demanded answers from Jake, asking why the father of a missing child would choose silence over action. Narratives began to shift. What started as a community tragedy evolved into a polarizing drama, one that played out not in courtrooms, but on screens. The pressure mounted. Each interview Rebecca gave seemed to widen the gulf between her and Jake. Each tearful plea cast a darker shadow over his silence. And the more the media repeated Rebecca's warnings, the more chilling they became. She saw something. She knew something. She said something. And still, Emmanuel vanished. In the court of public opinion, the verdict was already leaning. Jake wasn't just a suspect. He was becoming a villain. A man whose silence, whether by choice or guilt, became louder than Rebecca's desperate cries. But in this storm of coverage and speculation, one truth hung over everything. Emmanuel was still missing. And the louder the noise grew, the easier it became to lose sight of the only voice that mattered. The voice of a child who couldn't speak for himself. At the heart of this case lies a chilling triangle. Rebecca's cry, Jake's silence, and Emmanuel's disappearance. Rebecca spoke. She noticed the anger, the secrecy, the shadow in Jake's behavior. Her words now hang in the air, like an unanswered alarm, the kind that blared but nobody acted on. Jake, on the other hand, stayed silent. He offered no public pleas, no visible urgency, no broken voice asking for his son's safe return. Silence can be telling. Sometimes silence isn't peace. Sometimes it's guilt. And then there's Emmanuel, a child too small to cry for himself, too innocent to leave any trail behind. He didn't choose this silence. It was forced upon him. Every case has a fingerprint, a signature, and though Jake may have left no trace, no witness, no confession, no camera footage, his handprints are all over this case, even if unseen. His absence where presence was demanded. His quiet where a father's roar should have been. These are marks just as damning as physical evidence. This is the central mystery. A cry ignored, a silence that speaks volumes, and a child lost in between. And the deeper we go, the harder it becomes to shake the suspicion that Emmanuel's disappearance isn't a mystery of chance, but a story written long before it happened. So tonight we ask the question no one wants to confront. If Rebecca's warning was ignored, and Jake was left untouched, then who really failed Emmanuel? Because this isn't just about one missing child. This is about what happens when the cries of a mother are drowned out by death. When systems built to protect children hesitate, and when silence is allowed to masquerade as innocent.
Yeah.
And here's the hardest truth of all. Silence is not neutral. Silence is a choice. Silence becomes an accomplice. Emmanuel didn't just vanish into thin air. He was erased by a web of silence. And maybe, just maybe, that silence is what Jake is counting on. But here's where we draw the line. DetectiveMax isn't here for clicks. This channel isn't about algorithms or entertainment. This is about a child who cannot speak for himself. Emmanuel's voice has been stolen, but that doesn't mean his story should fade. So I'm asking you, no, I'm challenging you, to join this fight. If you believe Emmanuel deserves justice, then stand with us. Subscribe not just to a channel, but to a community that refuses to let silence be the truth. Comment, share, speak his name. Because every time his name is spoken, the silence loses its grip. Rebecca cried out. Jake stayed silent. Emmanuel disappeared. But silence will not have the last. Not here. Not with us. Because silence is how cases die. And silence is exactly what Jake is counting on. And we will not let him win.